Welcome to Sis Flicks, the podcast where we won't judge you for talking through the movie. Sis Flicks are the movies you laugh at, yearn for, and overanalyze with your girls, significant others, and now us.
We are your hosts,
Paola
and Nadhya, two sisters and designers who discuss chick flicks we hate to love,
tropes we love to hate,
and all of the aesthetic choices in between. Join us as we break down our favorite movies together.
Hey, sister.
Hey, sister.
How you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
All right. Happy spring. By the time this releases, it'll be officially springtime.
Yeah, so by the time you guys are hearing this, it'll be late March. We will be ending Women's History Month. It'll be spring. We will be in the midst of welcoming Easter. We will be mid to late Ramadan. So happy Ramadan for those of you who celebrate. And don't forget to file your taxes because we live in this society in spite of
happy taxes,
all of my protests. So happy taxes, whatever, as if that's not a fucking oxymoron. Yeah, so just like a little housekeeping at the top. Do you want to talk a little bit about Springerton?
Yeah, and it's almost time for Springerton, which is our name for Bridgerton season, hitting right around this beautiful springtime. It's so like perfect to have like Bridgerton releasing right around this time because it doesn't it give you like spring, flowery, feminine vibes. It's amazing. By the time we release this episode, there'll probably be a new trailer out. So we're excited to talk about that on our next Hit Clips. So I'm excited to see that. I feel like that's any day now. We should be receiving a new trailer for that. They're doing the rewatch for season 2. So I think after that, they're going to probably release some new trailers. So can't wait. That'll be exciting.
Yeah, if you guys are on Instagram and you're on the Bridgerton broadcast channel, they're pretty good about releasing a lot of like behind the scenes content. If that's something that you're interested in, it's always really fun to see like little pictures and like read little facts and stuff about the behind the scenes filming of seasons 1 and 2. And I don't know about y'all, this could be controversial, but I'm a season 2 girl. That's my shit. Season 1 was like cool and I enjoyed it, but season 2 was really it for me. So I don't know if season 3 is going to top it. We'll see. I'll approach it with an open mind.
Yeah, season 2 brought the yearn for sure. Like it was the slowest of burns and it was like the best slow burn. Season 2 for now. Let's see what season 3 does. I don't know. I think they set a high bar with Anthony and Kate.
They definitely did. I know a lot of people who believe the absolute opposite, who like did not like Anthony and Kate and really loved Simon and Daphne. That's great for y'all.
But I think that depends on like how you, what kind of romance you like to consume. Like if you like it hot and heavy, you're definitely Simon and Daphne. If you're there for the yearn, for the longing, for the pining, you're there for Anthony and Kate.
I'm there for the angst. I'm there for Anthony being pissed that he likes Kate. Like I just want everyone to be like a little angry and very hot for each other. So season 2 was definitely it for me. Speaking of sexy period dramas, y'all, Mary and George releasing in the US on April 5th has already been out in the UK for several weeks at this point.
And Nadja's been watching it illegally?
Wow. Okay. Wow. I was going to say something way vaguer. Like, for the sake of legality, I'm not going to disclose whether I've watched it all or not. But, okay. No. Let's reveal crimes. So.
No. Yeah, that's a better intro. Go for it.
I will not overtly disclose whether or not me, my American ass, my non-British, non-Sky TV having ass has watched all of Mary and George. But what I will say is, wow, when you guys do watch it, I'm so excited to talk to you about it. Because, whoo, what a program. What a show. What an absolute vibe. I hope in my heart that someone lets Nicholas Galitzine take a nap. I think he's so tired. I think he's just done back to back works, like WERKS works. That man is in need of 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep post haste. Because the way that he has labored for our cultural consumption, he's doing the Lord's work.
That's right, my boy. Do your thing.
Also, like, Julianne Moore is exquisite. Just absolute fucking vibes. Like, again, for legal reasons, I haven't seen the show, but I can assume that she's great. So once we're able to watch this show stateside, I can't wait to talk about it further in details that I don't know because I haven't seen it.
Sure.
Great fucking miniseries. Also, like, it's interesting to hypothetically watch a miniseries because maybe before the era of streaming, I think before the return of prestige TV, this is the type of idea that would have been undertaken as a movie, and I don't think it would have been as in detail or as successful if it were made as a movie. Make no mistake about it, miniseries are like my preferred medium because you have this fixed end point, but you also have a lot more time to like cook up and develop your story and dive into some details that may be left out of a film adaptation, maybe left out of a 90 or 120 minute runtime. So miniseries are the fucking way to go. And that shit is juicy, amazing. I thought it was going to be a much more sexually graphic, I guess, type of show. And honestly, no. I mean, for people who came up on Game of Thrones, I didn't even watch that much Game of Thrones. I watched season 1. Like, we're chilling. I think the scandal of it is the social class, the society business, the royalty business, like, and obviously, like, sexuality and, like, the fluidity of sexuality, that could be perceived to be a scandal. Not, like, to me, but
it seems like not even so much, though. Like, just for our perception of the time, especially if you consume a lot of, like, British media. But you're seeing this, and this is pretty much based on, like, King James, who was Scottish and came up a lot in, like, French royal court as well. So there was just a lot of, like, whatever floats your boat, we kind of just like everybody's just floating each other's
otherwise
boats.
Just vibe.
Yeah, it's just vibes, and people just floating boats everywhere. So yeah, so I think that is really cool to see that aspect of this class at this time and just how different sexuality was perceived across countries and royalties in different countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think we tend to have a very sanitized view of love and sexuality. We've mentioned this before, I think, when we were discussing, like, maybe even Pride and Prejudice. We have this perception of, I want to say any time maybe before the sexual revolution, so, like, what, the late 1960s, that people were just prim and proper. If anything, I feel like the records that we have of life in the upper classes, of nobility or of royalty, are more than enough of an example of how people were living and the shit that people used to be doing. So Mary and George is not a totally nonfiction historical adaptation. It's not like taken at the letter of firsthand accounts of the time period. It is incredibly fictionalized, using real historical events as like touchstones for building a fictional narrative. So I think that's something else that makes it really fun because, I mean, just as you see with like Hamilton, right? Like the musical, even if you bake all of these real life people into historical fiction, what that ends up doing is sparking more interest in the historical figures and like pushing more people to find information on who existed and what they were actually like outside of their depiction in whatever production it is that they see. So I think that's really cool. Anything that sparks a little curiosity in people and does it by entertaining them, I think is a really great resource. So yeah, there's like a lot of modern language. There's a lot of modern interactions between people in addition to the modern language. And that just makes it more accessible to us and more accessible to our understanding. The show itself will be great once I see it very legally. So can't wait to talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I love it. I can see like a whole Sis Flicks Hit Clips episode probably.
Oh, yeah.
On recapping that.
Yes, I can imagine.
So that'll be fun.
Yeah, hell yeah. Also, the Oscars have just wrapped up, so you guys know that our last episodes were on Past Lives, and unfortunately, in spite of all the nominations, Past Lives did not take any Oscars home, which is a bummer. Oppenheimer won huge at the Oscars. Everybody got to see Ken perform I'm Just Ken.
That was the best part of the Oscars was I'm Just Ken, the performance. Like, if you sat and watched the Oscars, you viscerally saw the way that this performance just like hyped everyone up. It was like a shot of dopamine. Like that same shot you got in July when Barbie came out in 2023. You got like just a smaller dose of that in this award show this year. So that was fantastic.
It was super fun. And also, like, briefly, I want to crown the monarchs of the 2024 award season red carpet. Greta Lee and Coleman Domingo.
Oh, yo, serving looks.
Serving life. Did not miss.
Not one of their looks missed. Coleman Domingo was like sparkling in all black. And Greta Lee with the black and white look, oh, she looked amazing. Fantastic.
And obviously we can't close out a conversation on the Oscars without mentioning Jonathan Glazer's speech. One of the bigger, I guess, more controversial points of the Oscars was Jonathan Glazer's acceptance speech when he was awarded Best Foreign Film, because he wrote and directed this movie that dealt very intimately with like Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, right? And something that he mentioned during his acceptance speech, which I thought was really poignant and again, very, very controversial, was drawing a comparison between Nazi Germany, the atrocities of the Holocaust, and the many atrocities currently happening in the present day across several different countries, but obviously I think one of the most publicized being in Gaza. So I thought that his speech was really artfully worded and one of the only kind of bigger signs of, I don't even want to say necessarily like protest or resistance, because I don't think that's like what it was. I think one of the aspects of the award show that shone a light on what was happening outside of that massive, glorious, incredible, glittering auditorium, and reminded us like, we make these movies to tell you stories, and this particular story is supposed to remind you why shit like this shouldn't fucking happen anymore.
Right. And drawing light to essentially say this is happening. You know, and the way he said it was so poignant, because I think he's also speaking as a Jewish person, saying, don't corrupt my identity to justify more of this happening to other people. And I thought that was so poignant and so brave of him to do on that stage.
And I mean, having his words misconstrued and taken apart by the media, which of course happened immediately. And I think the Oscars and award shows at large, like throughout history, we've really only had the Oscars for not even 100 years. They've often been, literally and figuratively, the stage for protests, the stage for social statements and political statements. Marlon Brando famously had Sachin Littlefeather accept his Oscar for like Best Actor.
Yeah, and that was like to bring attention to,
I believe it was like Richard Nixon's treatment of Native people, and people almost came after her physically for doing that.
Oh no, she was blacklisted after that. You never saw her in Hollywood again.
But they go like, people at the awards show were like, I want to beat the shit out of this woman. Or even like Sinead O'Connor tearing up a picture of the Pope, being like, hey, he's covering up tons of sexual abuse, and her being blacklisted for that in the 90s. So like not the 70s, not the 50s, in the 90s. So people use their platforms at these award shows and at these big public events in many, many different ways. And I think it was really courageous of Jonathan Glazer to use his platform that, you know, I'm sure he had some sense of like, oh, my film was probably going to win, but like that he couldn't even have been 100% certain that he was going to be able to have or to use. And I think it was really courageous of him to go up there and be like, hey, you saw this movie and you think, oh shit, everything that happened was really terrible. Guess what? It's still fucking happening.
Kind of happening.
You should continue to think it's terrible. It's still pretty fucking terrible.
Right. If this resonated with you, then.
Yeah, if this resonated with you, I've got current events to talk to you about. There were a handful of celebrities also wearing like actors for Ceasefire in Gaza, like pins on the red carpet. Mark Ruffalo has been another actor who's been pretty vocal about that on the red carpet. Rami from the TV show Rami. And he was also in Poor Things. Obviously, he was on the Oscars red carpet.
Even Billie Eilish.
Oh yeah, Billie Eilish was also wearing a pin for Artists for Ceasefire in Gaza. So yeah, slowly but surely we will gain more visibility and hopefully find our way to a ceasefire.
She won the award for Best Song for Barbie. So I was that was another proud moment for the Oscars. I was excited for her. That was their second sibling duo.
Oh my God, yes. Isn't that crazy?
Well, and I think they broke records, like making her the youngest person to win 2 Oscars for Best Song.
Yeah.
I think the first one was for 007.
Yeah, it was a James Bond song.
And then this one, I mean, kudos. They're amazing composers, both of them, her and her brother. It was the only Barbie win, but we'll take it. So the Oscars didn't give Greta Gerwig her flowers for Barbie, but we are going to give her some flowers for her amazing work as an artist and Little Women, released in 2019. Her vision of Little Women is my favorite. I think it's the most poignant in delivering the message by Louisa May Alcott in her book, Little Women, written in 1868. I love the life that she brought into this story. So thank you, Greta Gerwig. And again, happy Women's History Month. This is one of the women that inspire us to love movies and amazing storytelling. So Little Women, released in 2019, was directed by Greta Gerwig, and it was based on the 1868 novel of the same name by Louisa May Alcott. So this film stars Saoirse Ronan as Jo, Timothée Chalamet as Laurie, Emma Watson as Meg, Laura Dern as Marmee, the mom of these 4 beautiful girls, Florence Pugh as Amy, and Elizabeth Scanlon as Beth. And the fabulous, I mean, it was so nice to like see Aunt March played by Meryl Streep.
I thought that was so funny.
Because she's in the film for maybe a total of 8 minutes. And, you know, Aunt March, we don't really like Aunt March, but she just brings like this delicacy to Aunt March. So love Meryl Streep. Bob Odenkirk as Father March. Just a bunch of great performances in this movie. The music in Little Women is by Alexandra Desplat, who is booked and busy working on a ton of acclaimed films just in the last 2 years. We know him best from The Shape of Water, The Grand Budapest Hotel, The King's Speech, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. I mean, this guy loves a British film. And Twilight Saga New Moon. The cinematography by Yuri Glaceau, whose work is mostly in French films. And we have the production design by Jess Gonchor, who designed No Country for Old Men, True Grit, among a bunch others. I can definitely see the production design quality between No Country for Old Men and this rendition of Little Women. That's actually a funny comparison.
I like that. That's a really good observation. I thought the same thing. When I saw the list of other movies that he had worked on, I was like, oh, this all kind of has a thread. This all makes sense together.
there's like this raw kind of worn, lived in quality to the coloring and the set, production and everything. I think it's very fitting. Mm-hmm. And for costume design, we have Jacqueline Duran, who worked on none other than Atonement, Barbie. I mean, this woman, queen, she has won the Oscar for Best Costume for this very film.
Jacqueline Duran, as a costume designer, like I really, really, really admire her. She's obviously very prolific and her projects overall have a high production value and like very sharp design. She designed the costumes for Pride and Prejudice. So if anybody is going to know the differences in society and the differences in necessity and how much the characters need to move and how much they need to portray of their level of wealth or their place in society, it's gonna be fucking Jacqueline Duran. Even as a British based designer, someone that just has more experience in that frame of history, coming to do like an American portrayal of an American story. I love the costumes, obviously in Pride and Prejudice. If you guys need to hear me talk more about that, and go back and listen to our episode. Little Women was nominated for just a shit ton of awards. Just Oscars, it was nominated for Best Picture, Best Actress for Saoirse Ronan, Best Supporting Actress for Florence Pugh, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Original Score. And it won the award for Best Costume Design. And it took a ton of nominations at the Critics' Choice Awards, a ton of nominations at the BAFTA Awards, and 2 nominations at the Golden Globes. So this movie, I mean, it was very critically acclaimed and critically lauded, and I think deservedly so. I think there are a lot of things about this movie that vary from previous iterations of this story and vary from the source material, but in a way that makes it a little bit more, I don't know, accessible, I guess, to a more modern audience. This is another one of those movies I feel like is like a warm cup of soup, you know, like a warm cup of soup and a crusty piece of bread. As I was sitting down and taking some of my notes, I was watching this with my husband and he was like, this is like really nice. Wow, this is like really nice. And I was like, yeah,
All right, I'm gonna hit you with the scorecard. Is this a straight or queer love story? It's not much of a love story. I think the story here is about sisterhood. It's about womanhood and the many relationships that form us and form our paths and personalities. Of course, in there, we do have romantic relationships, but the romantic relationships are not at the center of this story. The sisterhood is at the center of this story. Does it have source material? Yes. The 1868 novel of the same name by Louisa May Alcott. This is a coming of age story that has not aged ever. This story is still very relevant today. And I think that there are little girls all around the world still being introduced to this amazing novel. This story by a man or a woman. This story is by a woman. The source material, the novel by Louisa May Alcott, and the screenplay was adapted and written by Greta Gerwig herself. So the screenplay is by a woman, and the director behind this film is also Greta Gerwig. What's the trope? Feminism, baby.
I mean, honestly, I think that's like just the biggest trope. That's just the biggest like part of this book. Not book, sorry,
No,
biggest part of
truly.
this movie. Like it's feminism.
Yes, 100%. This is a story about family and sisterhood. We touch on marrying for true love. We touch on marrying for convenience. We touch a little bit on a friends to almost lovers. There are so many layers to this story because we are also following the lives of four very different women and the way that they see life and the way that they see romance and the way that they see womanhood are all very different, and we get to explore that. And I think that's the beauty of this film.
Absolutely. I'm personally approaching this movie pretty like fresh, right? So like I don't have a ton of history with the source material or the previous adaptations of the source material. So I'm like in the process of reading the book currently, but I watched this movie initially without having read the book, without having seen like the 90s version of Little Women with Winona Ryder or like any of the previous adaptations. And even watching it without that cultural context, I was still able to find a lot of meaning and like tenderness and love for these characters and familiarity with these characters, even though like the experience of a Civil War era American woman could not be more different from my own. But I think that there are themes and like threads of femininity and womanhood and patriarchy that remain really consistent. And that's one of the reasons that I think Greta Gerwig was so well equipped to tell this story. I mean, obviously now we're looking at this retrospectively with like Barbie in her oeuvre, but like at the time that this was made, she had done Lady Bird. And she had, I think, written and starred in like Frances Ha, which is an indie film, I think in like 2011, 2012. And we didn't have this, I think, view of Greta Gerwig that we currently do as like the coming of the American female film director. And I think contextualizing this work with her other works so far makes it obvious why she was a great choice for the person to like undertake the writing and directing of this movie.
No, 100%. And the writing is great. Like there's great dialogue and like the dialogue overlaps consistently. You're balancing so many different ideas at the same time. And I think she's so good at that. Like we see that in Barbie, obviously, with like the real world and Barbie Land. Having those two ideas play in your head and like that makes the movie smart in a way. But then you see it in Little Women in like overlapping conversation between the sisters, all expressing different things, and how that contributes to like the bigger picture of the message they're telling you. Women are multifaceted. There's not just one type of woman, there's multiple type of women, and these are all under the same roof. Even what you say when you're like, oh, you know, this is like during the Civil War and like, how can you relate to that? But like their family, they're abolitionists. And there's a line in the movie where the mom, who they call Marmee, is that her name?
No, I think that's just her nickname.
Says at one point when she's like volunteering, right? She's volunteering to help out with the soldiers who are coming back home due to wounds or whatever. And she says, you know, I love a country that I'm not proud of. And like even that is kind of like a statement of resistance in a way. There's just all these ideas and themes that she does so well in expressing in subtle ways that feel so smart.
Yeah, I agree. All right. And digging in a little bit to the back of the book summary.
We haven't given the summary. My bad.
You're good. That's one of those things. So like this episode, this recording, this installment of our teeny tiny little baby podcast is definitely going to be a little bit more of like a vibes and ideas discussion rather than a faithful scene by scene retelling. We just have a lot of kind of like larger themes that we want to talk about, and we just want to try out kind of a different type of formatting for our podcast and play around a little bit and see what we like.
But either way, I'm going to intro it and give you the back of the book summary. Back of the book, Little Women is a coming-of-age novel written by American novelist Louisa May Alcott, originally published in 2 volumes, in 1868 and in 1869. The story follows the lives of the 4 March sisters, Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, and detailed their passage from childhood to womanhood, loosely based on the lives of the author herself and her 3 sisters. It is classified as an autobiographical or semi-autobiographical novel.
For the context of this movie, which, as we mentioned briefly earlier, is framed a little bit differently than previous adaptations or than the book, we're kind of meant to view the entirety of the movie retrospectively in a nonlinear fashion as we go back and forth in time. So Jo March will reflect back and forth on her life, telling the beloved story of herself and her sisters, the March sisters, 4 young women who are each determined to live life on their own terms. I just want to, very briefly, for those of us who were not familiar with this story before watching this movie, or maybe still haven't watched the movie and are thinking on whether we should watch it, not that familiar with the source material, this story centers around the March sisters who are living in Massachusetts during the Civil War, and their ages range at the start of the story from 12 to 16. They're all about a year apart, which sounds incredibly chaotic, and it's really their coming of age, them living in this society, again, that is like incredibly patriarchal, that really limits how much they can realize themselves as women and how much they can realize themselves individually outside of like marriage. And our heroine, the main character, is the second oldest, Jo, but we really do get like visibility into all 4 sisters' lives and what happens to them, like as they grow. And I think one of the most successful things about this story, not necessarily just this movie, but like this story in general, is the relationships between the sisters and the like love and friendship that they're able to have, even when they fight. I think the fights feel like pretty realistic. But as we move through the story, everybody ages. They're not in a wealthy family. Their father is off in the Civil War serving as a chaplain. They are doing tons of charity work all the time, in addition to like working and trying to earn money. You see a lot of that kind of economic conflict as they grow older and as they eventually have to get married and choose partners. We see them come across lots of like secondary characters that contribute to them in their development. And by the end of the story, 7 or 8 years later, when they're significantly older, one of their sisters, unfortunately, has contracted scarlet fever and has passed away, Beth. The remaining sisters, Jo, Meg, and Amy, are fully adults, either working for their living as Jo, as a teacher, married with children as Meg, or married and beginning her family with a wealthy husband like Amy. We see kind of how their humble beginnings led them to become the women at the end of the story, establishing themselves and establishing their families. Little women, little problems, little lives, but not quite so little. The problems are not quite so small. The lives are not quite so small. They're all pretty remarkable in ordinary ways. That's something that we talked about a lot when we were talking about Pride and Prejudice, how these little machinations that women make throughout their lives are the things that really contribute to like the fabric of not only the lives of women, but the lives of their families, the men in their families, their children.
And federal government.
Local government versus federal government. Yeah. And just after that really high level kind of overview framework, the bare bones of what this story is, we're going to dive into like some of our favorite parts, like some of what we think is really relevant and some of what we think is important. So something that I found really interesting. So as I mentioned, right, like I don't have a lot of cultural background regarding this story. This is so embarrassing. I think literally the first time I heard of Little Women, the novel as a concept, was in an episode of Friends where Rachel and Joey swap books, and Rachel makes Joey read Little Women and Joey makes Rachel read The Shining.
Yes, I remember that.
I mean, you know, I was watching Friends when I was like a child. So that was like the first time that I had heard of this book. Otherwise, I didn't really know anything about it. And I still haven't actually seen the 1990s, like Winona Ryder version. There are numerous other versions, both as miniseries on like the BBC and like in the US and in Canada, and then full film adaptations like the 90s one. There's another one in the 40s, and I think another one in the 60s. And I haven't seen any of those. I really like haven't consumed very much relating to this work, but I saw this movie one night mid-pandemic. It was like summer of 2020. Paola fell asleep on the couch. I was watching it solo. It just lit this spark of like tenderness in me and like recognition and understanding for these characters. Something similar, I think, to what I experienced when I watched Pride and Prejudice. That feeling of like, oh, I guess being sisters hasn't changed all that much after all. I guess after all this time, sisterhood's not really all that different. The girls are all pushing and they have this great physicality with each other, and they're talking over each other a lot, and they're reacting to each other mid-sentence, and like there's something very raw and authentic about how they interact. And I think Greta Gerwig captured that in this movie especially well. It's hard for me to watch this movie without just doing like a constant comparison to 2005 Pride and Prejudice.
You know what? And it's funny because just like you said, I also didn't have any previous context when watching Greta Gerwig's portrayal, and going into it, I'm like, oh, it's a period piece. And like, even the way they're dressed, like to me, I was thinking like 1800s England, but the customs are slightly different. Like there's so much more liberty in what they're able to do and how they're able to interact with the male sex, where I was like, oh shit, oh wait, oh no, there's a bit more liberation here. There's a bit less restraint. And that felt refreshing. And I guess that's one of the differences in like Regency era England and colonial America, essentially. I mean, I know it's not the colonial times, but you're talking about a similar time period, mid 1800s, right? You know, where the period films that I was introduced to up until that point all took this time period, and you're watching it from a British point of view. Seeing Little Women from an American point of view in this time period was refreshing. And just like, you know, even though society still had these constraints on women, these women se la buscaban. Like they figured their shit out. They went and found jobs. They, you know, worked to help maintain their families in whatever way they can find, whether that was teaching or, you know, working in a home or writing. You know, that was a big difference that I saw. That's something that stood out to me in comparison to like Pride and Prejudice, which takes place pretty much only what, 40 years prior.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, even in the written medium, right? Because what, Pride and Prejudice was released 1813. This was released
1868.
So yeah, a difference of 50 years.
I think it's interesting that, so 1810s, you're still in the Regency era in England, but really like the remainder of the 1800s is the Victorian era. So
yeah,
there are many kind of social changes, and especially, I mean, when I look back at history, just because of my background, I kind of look at it in chunks of like trends, right? And like what people wore and how they dressed. And when you're looking at like that type of human history, you find that it's indicative of a lot of social change. Like what women and men wear at different points is indicative of what they were doing. The clothes followed the need, right? The clothes don't create the need. That's why you learn so much about society when you're looking at what people wear. Even the differences between like what they're wearing in the Regency era or at the top of the 19th century, and the mid 19th century, the utility, what they need, like it's so interesting to observe some of those differences. I also love the costumes in this movie. Like, there's a lot of character specific choices that were really, really smart, and color choices that were really smart for this movie to differentiate each sister from the other. I think something that the production designer and costume designer, Jacqueline Duran, accomplish is really getting a different voice for each sister. I think the same thing was accomplished in Pride and Prejudice like 15 years prior. I think one of the things that's kind of difficult to do in a family where the people are supposed to be similar but still very, very different is getting them each a period appropriate but unique to them look, right? And I think that's accomplished really well with color. Like, that's kind of like the building block. That's the simplest place to start. Who's going to be red because they're fiery and ambitious? It's going to be Joe. And then who's going to be, you know, soft pink and soft purple and like warm, you know, autumnal colors? Like, that's going to be kind of between Meg and Beth. And who's going to be blue? Because not only are they the opposite to Joe, not only do they sit at odds with Joe for almost the entire story, but they have a completely different approach to their femininity and their life, Amy. So setting you up visually with these differences between the characters, I think, is really important to the storytelling and is very successful. Again, Jacqueline Duran is like uniquely talented at these things. So of course she was the one that was going to win the Oscar for this. Like, come on now. But this movie regarding feminism and femininity and like gender, because I think there's a lot to be said with the character of Joe and like actual differences on her own gender, on her perception of her gender. I think in the 1860s, you're not going to talk about being non-binary or being trans, but in 2024, you're going to talk about being non-binary and being trans. And reading different accounts that Louisa May Alcott gave of herself and of Joe as a character who's loosely based on herself, actually not even that loosely, but Joe is like this very tomboyish, more masculine forward character based on Louisa May Alcott, who died unmarried, never had a husband, never had any children, avowed feminist and abolitionist. It's like a theory of a lot of people that she was queer. And like, Joe gives incredibly queer vibes for the entire movie, right? Because it's not that she resents womanhood. She resents what it means to be a woman in the patriarchal sense, what it means to be a woman in this framework of society. That comes out a lot in the movie. I think the dialogue is really smart and how she communicates that. It's something that I really find very interesting about her portrayal. And then reading up just a teeny tiny bit more on Louisa May Alcott and how she spoke of herself and how she saw her own femininity. Like, again, what we were just saying about Mary and George, like, we have this very sanitized view of what the past looked like. And I think it keeps us at this like larger distance. Like, oh, you know, they were so different back then. They were so proper and everybody was super religious and no one ever had sex.
Right. Like, no, this sanitation of the past. And also, womanhood is as fluid as anything else. So the fact that people wanted to put a structure to it, that's on them. That's not on women.
One of the things about this movie that is maybe a little bit divisive, just depending on how pure you want your adaptations of classic literature, is that it has a non-linear format. So it moves back and forth through time. And that can be really confusing because it's not always established on a title card, like what period of time you're looking at. You're primarily focusing on two big chunks of time that are 7 years apart. The first chunk of time being at the end of their childhoods and they're living at home together. Their father is still like away due to the war, and it's the four of them with their mother and their servant Hannah living in their home. Amy's 12, Meg is 16. So that's like the first chunk. The second chunk that you're going back and forth through is 7 years later. So Amy is 19 or 20 and Joe is probably 22 and Meg is probably 23-ish, in that range. By that point in time, like, Meg is married and has children. Joe is living away from home and working. Amy has been traveling through Europe and is learning how to be a painter. And Beth falls ill for the second and last time. So going back and forth between those two time periods, when the markers of what tells you you're in a different time period aren't as obvious as like a title card being like 7 years later, 7 years earlier, whatever, they use color a lot to communicate that to the viewer. So anything that's done in the quote unquote future part of the movie, what you can consider as the viewer to be the present, is all colored up in blue. And there's this kind of gloom over it. It's darker. There's almost like this like industrial sadness to it, to that time period of the movie. Whereas the earlier part of the movie, the 7 years earlier, all the girls are younger, living at home. It's this like bright, warm light. Everything is nice and yellow. It's sunny the majority of the time. They spend a ton of time outside. Almost all of the girls are like, I mean, Emma Watson has the darkest hair. Her hair is brown, but everyone else is like some shade of blonde. And so you just get like a lot of these shots where like the sunlight catches their hair and it kind of gives them these like halos, and they just all look very like young and very happy. And you get this sense that with the color differences and with the difference in lighting, they're just communicating this like loss of childhood, this loss of innocence, especially how childhood kind of ends for some people with their first big grief. And I think for this family, the first big grief is the loss of Beth.
Their first big step into adulthood or womanhood was when their mom had to go away because their father got injured at war. And then they had to kind of manage the home. So I think that's where a lot of their personalities kind of took hold and what they were responsible for. And then Beth got sick. And again, that's another, that's also attributed to their personalities, because the reason that Beth got sick is because she was the only one thinking about this family that they were being charitable to. While everybody was just trying to keep the home afloat, she was still thinking about this other family who was more in need than they were. And she went to help them out. Nobody would go with her. And that's how she contracted scarlet fever and got really sick, and it ended up affecting her health for the rest of her life. That was their first hit with like reality. You know, I think they were in touch with the world around them, but thanks to their mom and their upbringing, they didn't have these roles in life. They just lived in this home where they can imagine and make up and draw and paint and play music, almost a refuge. When their mom left and then they had to kind of step up and keep the home together, that's where you start seeing those real world aspects come in and affect their innocence, right? And it was also happening during a time when they're also coming of age, where you see the older ones starting to attract the opposite sex, and you start seeing that come into play and how they start to kind of relate to each other. For me, that's where you started seeing the shift.
Paola, what are your thoughts on the production design in this movie?
So for the production design, they actually modeled the March's home to Louisa May Alcott's actual family home, which is still standing today, is known as the Orchard House. And you can actually visit the Orchard House in Concord, Massachusetts. So Greta Gerwig actually went to Concord, Massachusetts to film there. And they scouted for a location where they can replicate the Orchard House. And they ended up finding a mansion next to like this lot that had a pond. So they did an exact replica of the home for this production. It's very unassuming. Like, you see it from the outside. By construction, it's considered like a colonial, right? Center hall colonial. You have the front door in the middle and it's just symmetrical. But there's no embellishment to the outside. It's literally black, which is, I mean, I love, by the way. If you love a modern colonial style, this house is it. But you learn about this family. There is so much going on inside. And obviously, this is a home that's modeled after an actual home of the author. So this wasn't intentional. But the way I interpret it is, by theme of the movie and the story itself, this home can represent the views on women, where on the outside, you're meant to fit into like this cookie cutter structure, but there's so much more inside. There's so many different personalities. There's so many different takes. It's fluid. It's in the same way that you kind of see this home from the outside, so unassuming, but there's so much life and personality going on the inside. But yeah, I thought it was so amazing. I mean, if you look up the Concord House, yeah, I mean, they did it to the T. It's amazing. This speaks to, obviously, the storytelling and also the production team, they did such an amazing job in visually communicating that this is a humble home, but it's so rich in culture and so rich in
Love.
yeah, because the home is so layered. It's layered in color. Although they're a humble family, there's flowers everywhere. It's well furnished, comfortably furnished. Almost like the way they dress themselves, right? There's so many layers in the use of color, in the use of texture, giving you this feeling of wholesomeness, of, it felt whole and complete, even though they come from what at the time was considered a humble family with not many means. They were so rich in everything else and never afraid to give, right? They were part of a community and they were a big part of the community that they lived in. And that's also portrayed in the way the home is, because there's pieces of different stories. There's aspects of different lives essentially in this home. And the production team, I think, did a great job of doing that just subtly. Again, where the home just plays like this refuge for them. The home to them was their stage. And like the March family, it portrayed each and every one of their personalities in the home itself.
No, I like that. I wasn't really looking at the home that closely for indications on their character. I was really focusing more on like costumes and how their hair was done and things like that.
What the home does, it captures you, the viewer, the same way I think you see it capture the main male character, which is Laurie. Right next door, there's the big mansion. In this mansion, there's like a rich old man. He had a family. I believe he had a child who passed away. He has a son who's away. And it's just the grandfather and his grandson in this big home. There's points where you see that the grandson, Laurie, is looking out the window at this much smaller home, almost in longing, wanting to know what's happening inside, wanting to see, because he can see through the windows. It's actually part of the book where he's like, you guys never draw your curtains. And he always sees them putting on these plays and they're always together and always having fun. And even that, it almost puts you, the viewer, in the space of Laurie. When you're looking from the outside looking in, coming from this big old house, he looks into this home longingly at this family because he sees how warm they are with each other. He sees what a great time they have. And he's pretty lonely there with his grandfather. And the first time that he's able to go into the home, it's almost like he walked into like a warm fireplace. Like it just embraced him in a way that he never wanted to leave that family again. And he doesn't. He sticks around. And I don't know if this line is in the book, and it's not in the latest adaptation of Little Women, but it is in the 90s adaptation with Winona Ryder. There's this line, right, where Amy's explaining to him that she always knew she was going to marry rich. He answers with, just as you knew you were always going to marry rich, I always knew I was going to be part of the March family.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah, that's not in this.
In whatever way he could. It didn't happen with Joe, and then he tried it with Amy. To him, the day he walked into the house, he said, no, this is what I want for my life. It's kind of weird because you get to kind of love Laurie because he represents like rich society at the time. But he's this person in this rich society who looks to them and admires them, even though they're considered poor at the time. Because you see these girls, they're struggling with acceptance throughout the movie. And you see a lot with Meg, who wants to be accepted into a higher society and likes luxuries and things like that. And it's kind of like made fun of a little bit and kind of teased because of her family's position. Then you see Laurie, who is part of this society and embraces them instead of pitying or seeing them as less than. He admires them for how they are. So you grow to love Laurie for that. And you see how he falls for Joe because you fall for Joe. Like, she's such a free spirit. And then you're so heartbroken for him when that doesn't work out. In this adaptation, and I think this was smart by Greta Gerwig, because when she presented the characters initially, already in their adulthood, figuring shit out, First, you meet Jo, and she's working her ass off, trying to get her work published, trying to make money to send back home. When she arrives back to the boarding house, there's this guy there. And you see like there's a little bit of chemistry, there's a little bit of back and forth. So now you're associating Jo with this guy from the jump. And the next person we're introduced to is Amy, who's in Paris with their Aunt March taking art lessons or painting lessons. And while they're driving down in their carriage, she catches a glimpse of Laurie. And this is the first time you see Laurie in the film. You can tell they haven't seen each other in a long time. They hug each other and they're like excited to catch up. Okay, come to this party, invite me, you know, wear your best clothes, blah, blah, blah. Now you as the viewer are visually associating Amy with Laurie. To you, that's like, okay, Amy and Laurie, if you're just watching with no context. When you're reading the book or when you watch the original adaptation where the story is taking place chronologically, you come to associate Laurie with Jo. When you see him later on going after Amy, you're kind of like, ugh.
Even just from like the trailer, you get such a strong sense of like Laurie and Jo because they're the ones who are like always around each other. Again, I think we mentioned this before, but the use of physicality in this movie, like everyone's touching a lot. Everyone's moving a lot. I think this movie allows all of the characters to inhabit their physicality really well. Like there's just a lot of physical touch in this movie, and that gives you that next step of like authenticity and believability to all of these characters. And I mean, kind of counterpoint to what Paola was just saying about like Laurie and Jo. The moment Laurie and Jo become friends, they're touching all the time. Either she's like shoving him in like a very tomboyish way or she's punching his shoulder. Anytime that he tries to be gentlemanly towards her, she rebuffs him. But it's borderline wrestling.
I feel almost like Greta Gerwig almost removes you from the time period because you're seeing this story from Jo's point of view. So everything she's doing seems normal. It doesn't seem abnormal to us as we're watching it. When you read the book and when you see the earlier adaptations, she stands out so much more in how everyone else around her is just prim and proper. You know, half of you feels like it's on purpose, and also because she refuses to conform to this idea of this is who she needs to be a woman. And also this is how she interacts at home, and most of their interactions are at home. So when she meets people outside of that, she's like, why do I need to change just because I'm meeting you out here and not in there? You see that with Laurie from the bat because he's also kind of hiding from society. And they find themselves in this space where it's just the two of them. And it's kind of like, yeah, well, I kind of don't really fit in here. And it's like, yeah, well, I kind of really don't fit in here either. You know, let's have our own party here. No, three's a party. Sorry. Two's not. Sorry. My bad. Two's not a party. And from the bat, like they have the dancing scene where they're dancing like maniacs all around the house. He's like, I don't really know the dances or how you guys do stuff out here. And she's like, yeah, me neither. Let's fucking jump around. And they do. That's their first interaction. And I think he loved her from the beginning.
Yeah. It's funny because she has such a distinct personality and such a distinct physical description in the book, which is really funny. Like her physical description is like literally, she's so long and lanky, she's like a horse. And you're like, what?
Yes, it is.
God damn.
Like, okay.
Right. Like, okay, girl, rude. But she has so many distinct attributes to her, but I think to the modern reader, she becomes like the teddy bear. And when I say the teddy bear, it's like she becomes the one that you project yourself onto. Like, oh, she thinks all of this stuff is stupid. It is stupid. That's me. Because we just don't abide by the same social norms anymore. I think that's part of why this story ages so well. Because there is this character who is organically irreverent to all of their agreed upon rules and things, and it helps a modern reader place themselves in the story.
Yes, absolutely.
I think it adds like a lot of layers for like a visual adaptation, like whether that's a play or a film.
That's something you expect, even like you were comparing this to Pride and Prejudice. You see that in the household and you find it different to the time, right? What's different is bringing it out of the household and applying it to other people outside of your home. And I think that's what Jo does.
I want to talk a little bit about like each sister's characterization and what I feel like they represent, like in the fabric of the characters of this story.
Yeah.
Jo, right? She's obviously like very, very headstrong. She's the one who doesn't abide by rules of femininity, wants to make her own destiny, is kind of like trapped by the confines of like patriarchy. I think that's another prevailing theme, is that they're all trapped by the confines of patriarchy in different ways, in spite of what they want, whether you want to be like a mother who stays at home with her children, or you want to work, or you want to have a profession that's considered to be like traditionally male. Like they all butt up against the limits of what they're able to do coming up in a patriarchal society. I also think that's like, not to sound so fucking whack, but I feel like that's like true feminism. True feminism is acknowledging that like all women should do all of the stuff that they want to do, regardless of whether you agree with that or not. And they shouldn't be limited because of being women. They shouldn't be limited by virtue of their sex. And there's a line in the movie that I really love, and I haven't gotten far enough in the book to know whether this is in the book or not, where like I think it's right as Meg is getting married and she's in the room with Joe, like right before she's going out into the yard to like do their little outdoor ceremony, which is like very precious. Joe does probably what I do to some of my friends, honestly, which is like, listen, I can get some money. We can get on the road. You don't have to do this. because Joe is she finds the idea of marrying willfully and like, she thinks it's like jailing yourself being with a man. She finds that so abhorrent that she doesn't understand. Like, why is Meg doing this on purpose? Like, why is Meg choosing this? And I think when I was a teenager, I was very similar. I think if I had read this book as a teenager, I would have identified really, really strongly with Joe. Now, as I'm older, I think you mix up the other characters as well. But like, she's like, we can get some money together. We can get out of here. You don't have to do this. I just want you to know that I'll leave with you. We can just live together. We're sisters. And Meg is like, Joe, like, I want to do this. Like, I am doing this on purpose. This is what I want. And Joe's like, what? Like, ew. And Meg is like, she says very gently and very respectfully, which are personality traits of Meg's that they establish early on, that she's like kind of the ideal gentle older sister. Paola is my Meg. She's like, just because my dreams are different than yours doesn't mean they're unimportant. Right. And I really loved that line. And I just love how it was part of that scene. I love how gently it was delivered. Joe's the kind of character where if you reprimand her, she like really doesn't accept that. So you have to like present things with kindness and make it obvious that it's something that's like born from love and not from like wanting to like change her or whatever. Right. She's very headstrong and does not like criticism, but also feels very free to put that onto others. And it's a little like Elizabeth Bennet. Like she can be really judgmental. Yeah. and I think that's why that line is so important. Yeah. I think it's also a reminder to the reader and the viewer of what femininity means, because we get so lost in like the idea of feminism. Obviously, yes, it's anti-patriarchy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be feminine in the traditional sense, or you can't celebrate womanhood in the traditional sense. I really like how a message that profound can be communicated to the reader in such a simple exchange between Meg and Joe. The reader and the viewer, right? Because again, like I haven't gotten terribly far into the book. Both of us are like at different points in reading it. But as the viewer of the movie, like that one like stopped me, because I remember being older than Joe. I remember being a 19-year-old little piece of shit and seeing things change around me in my life at the time and being an asshole about it, and like not understanding why people weren't doing exactly what I thought they should do all the time, because I was 19, so I knew what the fuck was up. And that's not a dig on my 19-year-old self. That's just people are allowed to make different choices than what you think they're supposed to make. And still be respected. Yeah, and they still deserve respect and love and care and all the same things that you deserve. Yeah, for sure. One of the things that she says that stands out for her character is, I can't get over the great disappointment that it is to be a girl, right? She's so disappointed that she has to be female in this world and that she has to conform herself in certain ways. Like, for example, when she meets Lori, she goes out to this party with her sister Meg, and then Meg is telling her all of the things not to do while they're at this party because they're not in the comfort of their home. They're out being judged by society.
And so her first interaction with Lori is pretty much like, ugh, I hate being a girl and my dress is dirty because I was standing by the fire and like now I can't dance and because people are going to look at me. Oh, and she says something. She's like, oh, Meg told me not to say that and blah, blah, blah. Meg to her is like this guide of like, okay, this is who I should be with when I need to present as a girl. You know, it's so different than who she feels she really is. I think that she also represents this duality that you don't really pick up on a lot. And that's like, for example, when she sells her hair to help pay for her mom's passage to go visit her dad, you know, she doesn't. She's like brave about it. She's like, yeah, I cut my hair. I don't care. And then one of her sisters finds her crying in the middle of the night. And they're like, oh, are you sad about, you know, mom having left? Mom had to leave them behind to go take care of their dad who got wounded in the war. Through tears, she just says, my hair. So out of everything that's going on in their life, she's so sad about having cut her hair. Even with all of this persona that she keeps up, you know, her hair to her was so important. And it's something so vain where you didn't see Jo as vain. She doesn't fix her hair. She doesn't care how she looks. It affected her so much to have to cut her long, beautiful locks. And I don't know if that's maybe what she felt to her was her last stronghold to femininity, or is it telling you like, hey, you know, she can be against all of these things and she can be against conforming to this societal view of the female gender. That doesn't mean she didn't love herself as a woman.
She wishes she didn't have to be the woman that everybody expects.
Right.
Because women can only be this one certain way, not the way that Jo is. And like, I hate, not actually hate, I'm like being dramatic. I hate how much I identify with Jo in that moment of like, yeah, I cut my hair, whatever. I'm doing it for the family. Like, I'm the man of the house. Ha ha ha. And then later just being like, fuck. Like,
like, oh, I loved my hair.
Jesus. Like,
right. Like you can be both.
Yeah.
And that's fine. But she almost like fights against it, which is why at that moment is when you kind of see that other side and you're like, ah, okay.
Oh my God. Like, obviously Jo and I are very different and like people embrace what they perceive to be feminine or femininity in very different ways. But like I got a pixie cut several years ago and I remember it took like a year for me to recognize myself in the mirror because I had spent my entire life having like medium to long hair and just being like, am I still a girl? Like, am I still like, do I look right? That's patriarchy, baby. People telling you, oh, short hair's this and long hair's that. Having that be so ingrained into your view of people and your view of yourself that like once you go in the other direction, it makes you question like, who am I? Do I even count? I remember even asking my therapist, I'm like, am I feminine enough? And she was like, do you identify as a woman? I was like, yeah. And she was like, great, done. You're a woman.
That's that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, and it's two things. Okay. So first, there's almost like this sense of like having to compensate one way or the other, right? So for Jo, her hair compensated for this feminine idea, right? When she cut it, she lost that. Even when we perceive a woman who has cut her hair or shaved her head or anything like that, there's always this idea that you need to compensate the other way. Your makeup's got to be on point. Your outfit's got to be on point to compensate for this thing that you don't have now, hair. And it's kind of like, why? What are we compensating for?
I felt like that when I cut my hair, for sure. I feel like that now. I've always felt like that about being a girl.
And it's almost like this unsaid thing, right? It's almost like an unsaid rule because you need like this acceptance from other females. There's this one scene in Barbie that I always think about. And it's the scene at the end where Barbie is speaking to Ruth Handler, right? The creator of Barbie. And essentially is asking Ruth Handler if she can be a real woman. And Ruth Handler's response to that is, you don't need my permission. Why do you need my validation for you to be a woman? Mm-hmm. Just your presence and how you feel makes you that already.
That part made me cry every time I saw the movie.
Well, it's a powerful statement. I think you don't have to. What permission do you don't need my permission. You don't need society's permission. All you need is what you already have. And then it goes into showing you, obviously, what's considered the experience of womanhood, right? Sisterhood, being a daughter, being a mother, being an aunt, just being free and artistic and caring for others. And this montage showing you that if you embrace these things, if you are already these things, if you already feel these feelings, that's all you need. You are a woman.
Yeah, my therapist would agree.
When she almost like confesses this vanity where she's crying over her hair, she confesses it to Amy, which is placed in the story as her opposite. She idolizes what it meant to be a woman of the time, to be proper, to be prim, to look a certain way, to act a certain way. Throughout the movie, she's always correcting Joe. Joe, don't say that. Joe, say it like this, or wear this. You know, if you do this to your hair, you'll look so pretty. And Joe's like, I don't care about being pretty. And she's also spoiled a little bit.
Amy's a brat.
But she's the baby. She's the baby.
Well,
so it's kind of like, okay, you know, you have all these different women around her kind of naturally care for her. Like she's never had to be the caretaker. Mm-hmm. One, because she's the youngest. When they were going through the experience of Beth being sick, she got sent away because she's the only one that had never had scarlet fever. Therefore, they were afraid she would also get sick. So she didn't have to deal with the labor of worrying and caring for Beth. She was guarded and protected from some of those not so fun experiences that the girls had to go through as a family. So there was always a little resentment between Joe and Amy.
I mean, Joe even says plainly, like, Amy has always had a knack for getting out of the hard parts of life.
Right.
And, as I was watching it, like, I'm the youngest of 4. I remember many times where my siblings would have said something very similar. Mm-hmm. Nadhya has a habit of getting out of the hard parts of life. Watching it, experiencing it through another character who you're like, oh man, this character's being kind of objectively shitty. And then you see their sibling dynamics and recognize them in your own family. You're like, am I objectively shitty?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy when you don't have to deal with certain things to be objective about it. Obviously,
spill
that's
the
what
tea.
objectivity.
Spill the tea.
That's what objectivity means, right?
Spill the tea. Speak on it. Insult me. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, yeah. No, I don't know that she comes off as judgy though, like Amy. I don't think that she's like judging everyone else. I think that she's a kid. You know what? And it's funny because in the movie, it's so much harder to see her as a kid.
Because they're grown-ass women actors.
Because she's played by...
fucking Florence Pugh.
Florence Pugh. You were introduced to Florence Pugh, who plays Amy, as an adult in the movie. And then when they do the flashback, it's still her. You know, she's just acting like a little girl. They do the little pigtails and pop, pop, pop. And based on who Amy is as a character, like the whole little girl act, it's fitting. It's who she's supposed to be. Mm-hmm. But it's a bit jarring to see Florence Pugh play that still in her, like, you know,
early 20s or late teens.
Yeah, it felt a little jarring. I understand the choice of keeping the same actress, especially when you're going back and forth in time. You don't want to be dealing with having to cast a younger version of Amy. In Winona's version, it's Kirsten Dunst when she's in the middle. Oh,
shit.
When I saw that after I saw Greta Gerwig's production, and I was like, oh, this feels so much better. It made so much sense to see like an actual little girl play Amy, because you dislike her less. It just feels like this is a little girl thinking of little girl things and being a little girl. But then they did have to cast an older version later on in the movie. She's the only one who's a different character as they get older.
Yeah.
It did feel weird to see Florence Pugh in her ripe age of 20-something.
So she's 3 years younger than me. Not quite.
Oh, so she's
in her
like 20s.
Yeah, she's like 2.5 years younger than me. So in 2019, she was like 23. So she was a woman in her early 20s playing a 13-year-old.
She's like a well-developed woman. She's like voluptuous and curvy. I was definitely a lot more annoyed with her as Amy in this adaptation.
It was strange. I think watching the movie the second time, I was like, okay, I'll suspend my disbelief about Florence Pugh being a grown-ass woman. But
right.
the first time I was like, this bitch is supposed to be how old? Like, I... And it's really like, I mean, her acting is very good, so you really just get it through like what she's doing, like that she's a brat. And there's this point in the, I know we're jumping around plot wise, we're talking about vibes. There's this point in the story in the quote unquote past where they're all at their youngest that will see them. So Amy's meant to be 12 or 13 and Joe is meant to be 15 or 16. And Joe goes to like a theater production with Meg and with Laurie and Mr. Brooks, who's Laurie's tutor, who ends up marrying Meg. Amy really wants to go. And Joe's a dick about it. Like, Amy wasn't going to go to begin with, but Joe went on top of that and was a total asshole and was like, no, you're dumb and young and stupid. Fucking stay home, idiot. So what the fuck does Amy do? Because she's 12 or 13, with the logic of a 12 or 13-year-old, she takes something that Joe has been working on, that Joe really loves, this like piece of writing, because Joe's going to be like this prolific writer, and burns it. No backups, no hard drives. No file saves, burns handwritten sheafs of paper to get back at her sister for being an asshole to her. I'm sure watching Kirsten Dunst do that wouldn't inspire the ire in me that was watching Florence Pugh do that. I wanted to jump into the screen and murder her with my bare hands.
100%. Watching this version of it, you're so pissed. Yes. Like, how can she have done that?
Yeah.
When you watch the 90s version of it, it's just like a little 10-year-old girl. And you're like, you fucking little bitch, but fine. She didn't know any better. She didn't know that she probably didn't have another copy of that. She probably thought it's easy to write another one. Like,
yeah,
something about Amy that is you don't see develop until later on. But she's also artistic. Each sister has like their art, right? Where Joe has her writing, Amy has her drawing and her painting. And although we view Amy as, you know, this spoiled little brat, you come to realize she was selling her drawings to be able to make a buck on the side. So even with her being perceived as a little brat, she was still very business minded. We start to see this as they get older, like this, like wanting to appease the outside world a little bit more. And you start seeing that a lot with Meg.
A big part of her character, I think, is performing femininity, being the symbol. I think she's supposed to be like the example, right, of like what conventionally a woman should be. And the thing with Meg, similarly to Jane in Pride and Prejudice, she's not an asshole. Like, you don't dislike Meg for being pretty or being sweet and boys like her or whatever. Like, Jane and Meg, when they're described as like pretty, they're mild-mannered, they're sweet, they're kind, whatever. Then you get to like Elizabeth or the Joe, and it's like, and this girl is like knows how to read and like yells a lot. Like, it's shit like that. So you're already like, if you're a person who likes the underdog, you're like, well, I fuck with Elizabeth, I fuck with Joe. But then they're like, and we love our older sister so much because she's so sweet to us all the time. Like, you're ready for them to be the ones beefing, and they're not. They ride for each other the whole time, and that's feminism, baby.
Kind of like what you said before, she knew exactly what to say to Joe to deliver her message. Yeah. And that's because as the older sister, she has seen all her younger sisters come up. She knows all their personalities distinctly. As older sisters are, you're like a small version of your mom, right? Where you're taking into account everybody's needs and what everybody's kind of going through. And she falls right into that pocket. She does, where she's kind of like the peacemaker in that she just wants everybody to get along. Right. She pushes Amy and Joe to like squash their quarrel whenever they're fighting. She's there to keep everyone on an even keel. And in that form, she's caretaking. With Meg being the oldest, she's the first one we see in a romantic relationship. Part of her personality is this easygoing person. Can maybe have her come off a bit of a people pleaser, right? Because that's part of it, baby, right? When you have to consider everyone's emotions around you and you have to regulate everyone. And she naturally gravitated to someone who is also very easygoing, also cares for others and is thinking about what others need as opposed to their own needs. And that ended up being John, who was Laurie's tutor. Well, not tutor, like his teacher, essentially. Like his governess, but the male version. So she falls for this guy who has a very similar personality to hers, but unfortunately he doesn't have a lot of money. He's just a teacher, which at the time, similar to today, don't get paid what they deserve. So we kind of see her kind of struggle with that, because in also having that bit of a people-pleasing personality, she also wants to impress others and for others to think highly of her. And being part of a society where a lot of that is based on presentation, how you look, how you dress, she wanted to be fancy. There's this tick of vanity to Meg.
And the irony of Meg marrying for love is how often she mentions that she hates being poor.
Seriously. Which is like, girl, from the beginning, she talks about like wanting nice things and, oh, it's such a drag being poor. Like, that's one of the things she says when they're having Christmas and they don't have presents. She's upset. And then she chooses to marry poor. And it's like, girl. But I think that's part of her character arc, is that by the end of the movie, she redeems herself by admitting that there's more to life than material things. Mm-hmm. There's this point where, this is around Beth being sick. Her husband, John, is like super helpful and super understanding that Meg has to spend a lot of time back home.
Yeah.
He's not taking shifts at work because he's staying with the kids so that Meg can be at home, right? So you start off by kind of questioning her choices, but she's choosing one value over the other. That speaks a lot to who John is and to why she picked John. And then as the viewer, you're like, oh, okay, this is why this is a good match for her, because, he's going to put others' needs before his own, the same way that Meg puts others' needs before their own. And then there's a point where Jo is watching them from a window. She's watching an interaction where they're discussing this fabric that she went and overspent on. Money they were saving for him to be able to buy his coat for the winter. She spent it on fancy fabric to make a dress. And he wants her to be able to have this dress. He's like, if it makes you happy, I will do whatever I need to do. And she says to him, there are more important things. You see this moment from Jo's perspective. She's looking down at them from a window. I think that's where you see her arc make a full circle. And that's where you also see Jo looking onto this match, or to this relationship with approval, where she realizes like, okay, that's what it means to be married and to have a companion and to have a team player. And I think this is also around the same time where she starts to question herself and feeling lonely.
Something that I think frustrated me with Jo when I was watching the movie, and I'm sure, as I continue to read the book, like, will frustrate me, is that she gives Meg so much shit for liking John, right? And it's not even about John personally. It's just the idea that Meg is gonna go be with a man and like start her own family. And the whole time she's like, Mr. Brooke is so dull. Mr. Brooke sucks. And it's like, I think in addition to her seeing this kind of completion of Meg's character arc, like witnessing it literally as the viewer from the window, I think she also gets to a point with Mr. Brooke, or Brooks rather, where she's like, oh, yeah, I can see why.
That made sense.
Right. I can see why people would want to be with people.
Right. Oh, companionship. Oh, okay.
Wild. Can't relate.
Wow. Right. Well, because I think she saw love as frivolous.
Yeah. And even like, Jo's character arc continues, I think, with her admission to her mother. And this is like shortly after Beth's death, where she's just like, maybe I made a mistake. Like when Lori proposes to me, like I should have said yes. And her mom is really the one who like sets her right and is like, do you love him? And Jo's like, oh, I don't know. I mean, I think I just need someone to love me because I'm really lonely. And her mom is like, yeah, that's not the same as loving.
Right.
Basically, in very simple words, being like, you think that just the act of someone loving you will be enough to make you happy, that you don't have to like give anything in return, that you're not going to feel like shit. You're not going to feel like it's an inauthentic experience, but you are.
Right.
You're not going to give that person the same amount of like respect that you want from them, or like the same care that you want from them. And like, that's not fair. Mm-hmm. And even just her telling her mother, like, I'm so lonely. You know, kind of like I miss this life that we have here, or that we had rather, like obviously before Beth passed away and like when we were all living at home. But like, I'm so lonely. At this point, Jo had been living away from home for like a while. She had been writing and selling stories and shit like that. But that almost felt to me like the actual end of childhood for her, because it's like, I can't do it all by myself.
To all of them, specifically in this scene, Beth was the representation of childhood.
Yeah.
I didn't think Beth was allowed to grow up because of her sickness. You know, she kind of stayed in this state of constant childhood, because even as she grew, she had to be watched over and helped. So to the rest of them, that's what Beth represented. And so when she passed away, it was almost like, okay, this is the finality. I think for Jo, that was like the last bit of their childhood that they had. You know, and something else that they say throughout the movie is that Beth is the best of us. So aside from Beth representing like this last little leg of their childhood, she also, to them, represented all their good qualities. Get rid of all these things that they considered false, right? The vanity or the judginess or being spoiled. Take all of that out, and then you have Beth, which is caring, thoughtful, selfless, humble. With her loss, Jo also felt like a big piece of their goodness went with that.
I agree with you. Like, I do think Beth was like the symbol of their innocence, their childhood, whatever. You know, there's a point in the movie where Jo is like, you know, I'm going to take Beth to the sea to like improve her health, right? And as she's there with Beth, Beth is like, you know, I'm peaceful. Like, I know that this is inevitable, and I made my peace with this, and you have to too.
Right. Like, you can't control this. And I think Jo always wanted to have this control over everything. And I think this is one of those times where she realized, when Beth helped her realize, like, this is not something you can control.
Jo was holding on so tightly to her childhood, to her idea of what constituted her perfect life. And like, you're holding all of these autonomous people that need to make their own choices and live their own lives to something that you want for them and for yourself. Like, what is it that Beth says in the movie? She's like, you know, it's like the tide. It goes out slowly, but it's going out.
Right. Aww.
She was the best. Beth was the best character. 2 parts of that movie made me cry. Beth, as a concept. No, like, Beth, when she passes away, because the way that Greta Gerwig chooses to show Beth's death, I think was really clever, where she juxtaposes, again, it's like this non-linear going back and forth through time. She juxtaposes the first time Beth fell ill with scarlet fever and the fact that she recovered against the quote unquote present time of Beth falling ill with scarlet fever and not recovering and passing away. And that totally made me cry, because you can see in the second time everything's blue, you know, like, so you know things are gonna go to shit because everything's fucking blue, and you see Jo moving down the stairs like slowly, like she is trying to not know what she's about to know. The first time it happens, everything's yellow, you know, shit's gonna be okay. Like, the first time it happens, Jo runs down the stairs. She's already crying, but she also is like, I need to fucking know, like, terrified. The difference, I guess, in maturity of how she accepts those two things, really, really smart, putting them right up next to each other for the viewer. So yeah, that totally made me cry. The other part that I cried was during Laurie's speech to Jo.
Oh, Laurie's speech to Jo when he's telling her how much he loves her.
Yeah.
And tell me about it.
Oh my God. Oh, it's so sad. It's sad for both of them. I think the first time I watched it, it was like easy to kind of villainize Jo, because it's like, girl, just say yes. The fuck are you doing? But you can tell that both of them are like, oh fuck, like our relationship is really going to change regardless. Timothée Chalamet played that part really well. I thought he was really well cast for it.
Yeah, there was parts where I liked him less. No, but I think he did pretty good.
Because it was Christian Bale in the 90s version, right?
Yeah, I really liked Christian Bale's portrayal. It was a bit softer, but he was also, like, in his asshole era, he was worse. Because he was, like, sarcastic.
Oh.
But, like, his declaration to Jo was, I felt it a lot more from Christian Bale.
Really?
Greta Gerwig, they're out in the field, right? And they're like, But it's so fitting to Joe's character, right? Like they're like in this wild environment and like there's wind howling and they're pretty much just chasing each other through this field while they're having this conversation. The focus isn't so much on the conversation. With Christian Bale, they're also outside. They're in a forest, like within a bunch of trees. So it almost feels more intimate. And he's talking to her and he kisses her and holds her. And like, there's a bit more romance in that depiction of it. So it felt more romantic and it almost didn't make sense why Joe said no. In Greta Gerwig's rendition, though, I think they're almost showing you, because she's out in this open space and they're chasing each other, having this argument. She wants to be free. As they're having this conversation, she's walking away from him. He has to grab her, and there's a lot more physicality to it. And the body language is saying a lot more, where the environment itself is telling you, you know, she doesn't want to be held down. Where you, Laurie, have to literally reach out and grab her so she'll stand still so you can talk to her. That's why this possibly won't work out. But even him as a character, you can see he's willing to deal with, you know, this is like Allie and Noah in The Notebook. Like, this is going to be hard, but we're going to work at it every single day. Yeah, we're going to argue, but I want this because I want you.
And then the viewer's
that was Laurie.
Should it be this hard?
Should it? That sounds a little toxic.
Like
I don't know.
My most controversial romance movie opinion is that, this is not controversial, I think, is that Allie absolutely fumbled the motherfucking bag when she didn't marry Lon Hammond. And you put that on my fucking gravestone. I'll die on that hill.
You know, having that in our minds, right, as far as media goes, and seeing Laurie makes this proposal, you're like, you know, it's almost like, oh, it's intense. But at the same time, you're kind of seeing why this wouldn't work out, you know, and you want her, but you see him so willing to do whatever it takes to have Joe, to be with Joe. Because what did she say later? You know, I care more to be loved than to love.
Yeah.
He would have given her that. He would have given her all the love in the world, regardless of what he got back.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't have been fair to him. And I think she knew that. And that's what she would say. But it sounded immature coming from her because they're still so young. But she's pretty much like, you're going to hate this.
Yeah.
We're not.
This will be bad for you. And it'll be bad for me.
To me, the heartbreaking part is where, like, no, you are going to fall in love with somebody. And I'm just going to have to watch.
That's what made me cry.
That to me
That's the one that got
was
me.
like, oh man. Oh, we didn't talk about Frederick at all.
Oh, shit, dude. And you know what? That's how Louisa May Alcott would have liked it. For us to just not address that man at all.
Oh, man.
Something that I do want to mention about this book in my incredibly limited research on it is that it was very much written for commercial purposes. Like, she wrote it to make money and sell. It was her art, and writing was how she made her living, but she wrote this to sell it.
Yeah.
There are aspects of this book that were made palatable by society standards for that era so that she could make money from it. And I was just going to say, I respect the grind, but something that this movie does that we haven't really touched on is, like, aside from the nonlinear timeline, the Joe in the future is almost a placeholder for Louisa May Alcott herself, because she's writing the story of their lives and selling it to a publisher. And she's in the process of selling it. As she's like haggling back and forth with the publisher close to the end of the movie, she gives him the book and he's like, well, you either need to get the heroine married off or you need to kill her, because we're not going to sell a book where the main heroine isn't married. And she's like, why? And he's like, you just have to. And she's like, all right, fine. Like, are you going to give me money for it? Fine. That's why Joe ends up with Frederick. She doesn't end up with Frederick and deny Laurie, for example, because that's how it was meant to be. No, it was when Louisa May Alcott was writing this book, she was like, I want Joe to end up alone because that's what she wants. That is what I want. I am Louisa May Alcott. I am Joe. And they were like, yeah, no, we're not going to sell that. And she was like, well, fuck.
Yeah, I thought it was very clever the way Greta Gerwig added that into the story. Mm-hmm. Obviously showing that Joe is writing the story of her life, representing Louisa May Alcott. Mm-hmm. As you see her submitting the book to the publisher, where Joe's story isn't done yet for the viewer. Like you've seen all the other girls kind of be paired off already. At this point, it's just Joe and her book.
And right, they find their resolution.
Right. When she's handing it off to the publisher's like, no, the main character needs to be married off. She's like, all the other ones are. It's like, she doesn't find anyone.
Yeah.
And he's like, no. And then right after she's like, okay, fine. The next scene is Joe chasing after Frederick, who came to visit her in Massachusetts from New York.
Yeah.
And then they meet at the train station under the rain.
It's very dramatic.
You know, like how it's very dramatic.
Yeah.
So you definitely understand that it was finished that way for purposes of being able to sell this book. As a romantic reader, as a romantic watcher, you feel satisfied for Joe because you also feel like maybe in the book he was meant to be just some guy, but in the movie he was there from the beginning and he guides the way in which she ends up writing her story. He helps in her development as a writer and ends up being the tool that helps her get published at the end, you know, and delivers the news of her book being published. Like, it's in a very unsatisfying way to this feminine story. He ends up being the vessel to how and which she became a successful author. But I think it ties back to a line that Aunt March said to her earlier on in the movie. You know, Aunt March is kind of like pressing her on finding a match and getting married. And she's like, I want to make my own way in the world. And Aunt March is like, nobody makes their own way in the world. That's not how that works. Everybody needs some push, some help or whatever. For Joe, it ends up being Friedrich, who ends up also being her love interest.
This is literally from Wikipedia, but as I was looking up Louisa May Alcott just to get some of her background info facts, but I just thought this was so funny. So in Little Women, Alcott based her heroine Joe on herself, which is something we've already discussed. I feel like it's fairly evident if you learn anything about Louisa May Alcott's life that Joe is based on her. However, Joe marries at the end of the story, whereas Alcott remains single throughout her life. She explained her spinsterhood in an interview with Louise Chandler Moulton, saying, I am more than half persuaded that I am a man's soul put by some freak of nature into a woman's body, because I have fallen in love with so many pretty girls and never once the least bit with any man.
There you go.
Okay,
girl.
bitch.
That's right.
She would have loved 2024 in some places in the world. Woo.
Well, there you go. Like, that ties to the T to exactly what you were saying before, where if you met Louisa May Alcott today, she would probably be queer.
Yeah.
That kind of solidifies that.
And historians will call them friends. She's out here like, I've been falling in love with bitches left and right. Historians are like, and that's what she called her very best friends.
They even live together.
That's one of my favorite things. Like, they live together. They were best friends. Oh, kill me. To wrap up this discussion, my G, we are gonna do our wrap up here at the back end of this hopefully enjoyable discussion on Greta Gerwig's Little Women 2019. Paola, I'm gonna ask you, book or movie?
That's hard because I saw the movie before the book.
Yeah, same.
But what happens many times is I'll watch a movie, I'll read the book, and then be pleasantly surprised by the book. The book gives you so much more than a movie can. I think Greta Gerwig gave you everything that book was trying to portray. I don't feel the movie adaptation is lacking anything from the book. And I think that's a first for me.
I like that Greta Gerwig brings in these references to Louisa May Alcott's real life, to like the publishing process of the book. From what I have read of the book so far, it reads almost like a play. Lots of dialogue with like little kind of asides that provide more context, but like tons of dialogue.
That's what it feels like. And even so, I listened to an audiobook version and it's different voice actors just talking. So even while you're listening to it in an audio, mine has different voice actors. And even listening to it, it sounds like a production. Like, it doesn't sound like, oh, and then she said, oh, and then he said. No, it's just you're listening to the story, not being told to you. you're listening to
it happening,
which was very different. That's the first time I've read an audiobook like that.
Now, second question. Will my husband watch this with me?
No.
Wow, I love that concise answer.
No.
My husband would watch this with me. He did sit with me to watch it. I watched it a little later into the night than he's normally up, so he went to bed. But from what he did see, I think he enjoyed it.
I take that back. I think he would. I don't know that there's any parts that would grab him, like where he'll be like, "Oh, what's the drama?" Because you don't feel like there's a lot of like,
there's no bomb
incoming
to disarm.
Right. There's not exactly right. Like there's not like the Mr. Darcy proposing scene.
Yes.
You know, it just kind of moves through these
love
lives
how
of
he
these
dad
different
watches
women.
that. I love that.
He's here for the drama. I was watching some of it with my daughter as I was doing her hair, and he sat with us for like some parts of it, and he asked questions. He was like, "Oh, okay."
Cute. On a scale of 1 to ardently admire and love, how do you feel about this movie?
This movie for me is a 7.5.
I was going to say 7. I don't want that to sound like a cop-out. A smooth 7 for me. You know what? It could bump up to 8 with time. Like if this became one of my rotation movies. But there are some things that kind of detract, like the jumping back and forth through time. I don't love, even though I think it's done well. It's just like not a choice that I would have made. But the acting, like the direction given to the actors, like the production design, the costumes, all of that is like fucking A+. I thought that was great.
No, the same. Initially, the jumping back and forth was confusing.
Yeah.
Having gone into that movie fresh. After having seen the earlier portrayals and after having read the book, I can understand the movie better and everything that was going on. I would still say it's my favorite adaptation because it felt so fresh and it felt almost modern. And you can see, like you said, the machinations of the publishing and how that was working out and how she was so vividly placed as Louisa May Alcott that it just felt more tangible, I guess. And I think the dialogue is great. The writing is great. There are a lot of lines that have stuck with me throughout the movie. And no, yeah, it's a 7.5 for me. It's great dialogue. And I just love the portrayal of so many different versions of who you can be as a woman and holding you accountable for respecting that, cherishing that through your friends and your sisters and everyone, even though their interpretation of being a woman might be different than yours. I love that.
I love that too. And I feel like that's valid in our sisterhood as well.
Yes.
So generational trauma, I'm going to say being poor.
And being a woman.
Ooh, gut punch. Gut punch right there. Being poor, being a woman. Don't do it if you can avoid it. I would advise against being poor or being a woman.
No, I am very proud of being a woman.
Yeah, I fuck with being a woman.
But just how much you're consistently questioned by everyone around you, including other women and yourself.
By the earth.
But celebrating womanhood as a sisterhood, I think, is also very important. And I do love that about this movie, that it not only portrays womanhood, but portrays womanhood in relation to sisterhood. Do they stay together? Well, yes. I mean, I think we saw Meg and John go through a bit of tribulation and they were able to get through that with grace. And I think that they're going to continue to look out for each other and take care of each other the way you see them do throughout the movie. Lori and Amy, for me, I think they stay together. I think that Amy, from the very beginning, when she laid eyes on Lori, she loved that man. She loved that kid so much. That was like love at first sight for Amy. I mean, I know she loves Lori. And I think that for Lori, Amy was what kind of gave him a wake-up call.
I think one of my favorite parts of this movie, and this will be one of the last things I say to wrap it up, only because I don't think I've mentioned it yet. And I think one of the bits of this movie that's become like iconic, like the specific adaptation, is when Florence Pugh is in the painting studio with Lori in like Paris or London, like they're in Europe at this point, and she's kind of like, yeah, I've given up on being a painter, like I'm just gonna marry rich, right? Like I'm a good enough painter, but like I'll never be great, and I need to know that and give up like kind of while I'm ahead and then marry rich. And he's like, oh my god, how could you ever say that? Like kind of like invokes Joe a little bit, like she would be so disappointed or whatever. And she goes through the whole speech of like, if I had any of my own money, which I don't, it would become my husband's as soon as I got married. If I could even have a job, which I can't because I'm a woman, I wouldn't even be making like enough money to support myself. If I ever have any children with my husband, they would be my husband's and not mine. I'm not going to be the one who can make my own money. Like, I have to be thinking, because he was kind of like, how are you going to give up on being a painter? And what do you mean you're just going to get married to a rich man? No. And she's like, shut the fuck up. Like, I have to take care of myself and my future family and my current family because my sisters ain't doing it. I got to do it. My parents are old and broke.
Credit to Amy that is stated at the very beginning of the movie is when Joe Friedrich is like, you're always working. And Joe's like, I love this line from Joe. Money is the end and aim of my mercenary existence. That shit, capitalism.
Capitalism, baby.
And directly after that, she says, it's up to me to take care of my family until my sister Amy marries somebody obscenely rich.
Respect.
Very early on in the movie, it's laid out to you that the trajectory of their family is on Joe's shoulders and on Amy's shoulders, the youngest. One by selling her own works and one by following the very traditional customs of the time, which was marrying someone of wealth.
Yeah, because Meg fumbled the bag. As soon as Meg fumbled the bag, it was like, damn, now this is our job. Beth dies. They're like, damn,
now we better get it together.
Really our job.
Right. It's very easy to see Amy as frivolous, taking into account her position where she's at in Paris with her Aunt March. But she's there at the request of Aunt March. She has to serve Aunt March, whether it's being her companion or painting for her or whatever. You know, the pressure on Amy is, if I don't make this match, if I don't marry the right person, my family can be poor forever. Like, if I don't marry this wealthy person, my family suffers. And that's the pressure put on Amy on one side of the spectrum. And then Joe is taking matters into her own hands on the other side of the spectrum, where it's like, I'm going to try to make money as much as I can, whether it's selling whatever stories I can make up for $20, $30 and sending the money home. They're both doing the exact same thing in two different ways. Both of those ways are both criticized by society and celebrated by society, depending on how you look at it. They're both being judged for what they're doing.
Even by each other.
But they have the same goal either way, which again speaks to the general theme that we touched on from the beginning.
Feminism.
The center of feminism is allowing women the freedom of choice and be treated and be respected and viewed upon equally, regardless of what place they hold in society and what they decide to do with themselves, their bodies, and their lives.
With that said, ladies and gentlemen, call your representatives in Congress. Vote. When we say women deserve the right to choose, we mean all the rights to choose.
Sisters and listeners, I think we would love to know what Little Women means to you. I think this movie, like womanhood, can be interpreted in many different ways, depending on where we are in our own lives. Join us next time, as we will be discussing similar themes revolving around womanhood and the roles women are made to play, specifically during the Regency era, where we recap Bridgerton Season 1 in preparation for Season 3 of Bridgerton. So thank you for listening to this Vibes discussion on Greta Gerwig's Little Women. If you like what you heard and you want to hear more, if you're a fan of this discussion format, please let us know. Leave a review anywhere you get your podcasts and come find us on Instagram at Sis Flicks Podcast and shoot us an email at sisflickspodcast@gmail.com. Let us know what you think. If you have any suggestions or a movie request for us to cover in the future.